Welcome to StratnewsGlobal. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our very special guest today is Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri. She's the director of the US and American program at Chatham House, and her research areas include geopolitics, multilateralism, and the global south. And if that's a mouthful, I could probably give you a whole lot of other things about how she's a prolific author, regular at international forums like these, but I think I'd rather have her talk than me telling you who she is. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Vinjamuri. Let me quickly start with the US, in the sense that, do you think Trump's coming back?
Oh, that's a very significant question. My own view is that the real data that we have to assess that are people's votes. So if you look at the midterm elections in the United States in 2022, Trump wasn't on the ballot, but he endorsed many candidates. And they actually didn't do that well. The Republican Party underperformed. In 2023, similar story. And so the evidence that we have so far, the polling puts him, he's doing quite well. Most recently, he's a little bit under Biden. But I think that the drivers of American voters right now are a number of social issues. They are increasingly about foreign policy, but they're really social issues. And I think Trump is suffering a little bit with women, potentially because of his decision to roll back abortion rights, the Supreme Court, but really the justices that he had appointed turned that. So I think there are a number of reasons to think that he's going to struggle to make it over the line. But as we know, the U.S. electoral system is biased towards a small number of states and really turning the outcome, the swing states. And so let's watch this space.
That's what happens with George Bush, if you remember, Florida and stuff like that.
Exactly. It can often come down to one state, a very small number of voters. So he certainly won't win the popular vote. The question is whether he gets, over the line in those swing states. So it's going to be tight. But, we don't even know for sure. There's so many unknowns, right? Biden is an older president. Donald Trump has 91 criminal charges against him. Probably there will be court cases well down the road by the time the election takes place. So I think that's going to potentially upset what we see. And we don't even know for sure if these two men will be on the ballot.
The other area which, I understand that you're very keen on is multilateralism. Where do you see multilateralism at this moment, given that, right now it's still a unilateral world in many ways? And but you do have a whole lot of other players now trying to say that, we must have multilateralism. Is multilateralism a valid force now?
It is. I think if you look at the large historic multilaterals, the UN Security Council, the World Trade Organization, the multilateral development banks, the Bretton Woods institutions, there is a sense in which certainly the UN Security Council and the WTO are stuck. And a big part of that are the geopolitical tensions between the major powers, and the unwillingness of those who have a share of the votes or a majority of the seats to really get on side the reform question. As they say in the United States, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. In other words, it's hard to get a major power to give up its power. So there's a sense in which they don't really reflect the real distribution of power. That's the first problem. Second problem is that they are just, not cooperating on the big global challenges. So you're right. Multilateralism is stuck, and we're seeing major powers, work around the system rather than through the system. And that is a problem in a world where the greatest challenges, whether it's climate change or creating rules for governing technology, especially artificial intelligence, those problems require collective leadership, collective solutions, and it's become very difficult to work through the multilateral system to achieve it. So I'm optimistic in the sense that, we've got to have collective solutions. So whether it's through the existing multilaterals or whether it's through mini-lateral forums like the Quad or AUKUS or smaller trade agreements, I still think that states are going to have to work together to solve problems that they have a vested interest in solving.
Yeah, the thing that strikes me every now and then, that President Joe Biden, I don't know whether it's, whether it's the Republicans who have actually managed to sort of show him as a doddering old man who doesn't know what he's doing. But that image is growing every day. Could that help Trump win?
It helps Trump win in a very specific way, which is that the Democrats who aren't enthusiastic about Biden aren't going to vote for Donald Trump, but they might not vote. And so the real concern is, will Democrats and young voters in particular, will they turn out and vote for a president if they don't think he's, youthful and energetic? And that could really help Trump, in effect. If Trump, continues on the current trajectory of being the candidate, both sides are going to be pushing hard on making sure that their base of voters are passionate, feel the urgency, and turn out and vote. And if they stay at home, which, in America, many voters stay at home, they don't vote. And if they do that, that could really change the outcome. So yeah, it matters for Joe Biden because the Democrats need people to turn out and vote. If everybody turned out and vote in America, the Democrats would do very well. Because demographically, they've sort of, they've really, they've got a majority. But people don't necessarily vote.
Because I remember seeing President Biden tumble down the stairs of Air Force One and thinking, oh my God, that seems like trouble. I remember that video very well. And of course, he got up and dusted himself off and managed that. But that's the second part of it. Coming back to what the world is now calling the Global South, it's a term that has sort of gained coinage over the last, decade. 5 years maximum? How powerful is that as a force? Because I'm increasingly sensing some kind of resentment at a whole bunch of countries thinking they've been left out of this growth trajectory or something.
Yeah, it's very interesting. This term Global South has been around for quite a long time, but you're right, it got currency and really global fame only in the last few years. And I think it's partly the U.S. and the West, and Europe and the U.S. have cottoned on to this understanding that much of the world's youth live in Africa, that a lot of the future of globalism and global leadership will depend on having a following in the Global South, on getting Global South countries to partake in these collective solutions. And it really all comes back to the relationship between the U.S. on the one hand and China on the other. And so there's a sense of real competition for who is going to win in the Global South. And, you see that, of course there's tension between direct tension, but there's also now a sense that China's had 10 years of the Belt and Road. They've put $1 trillion more or less into building up infrastructure in the developing world. And if you go back to the Cornwall summit, the G7 summit, just coming out of the pandemic, when they met in England, Joe Biden it was his first G7 as president, and they announced what was then called the Build Back Better World Initiative, which was going to be the international face of the U.S. domestic policy. And it was really aimed at saying we, the West, can compete with China. We can invest using our own values, our own norms. We can build up infrastructure in the Global South. We have a positive value. We have a proposition for the rest of the world. It isn't just China that has something to offer. We can offer something else. And we've seen this, in different iterations. When Secretary Blinken was here at Raisina last year, he said that the Quad, he was talking about the Quad, he said the Quad wasn't just about forcing countries to choose between the U.S. and China. It was about giving them an alternative, whether it was on the norms for technology governance or climate or digital, all of that. And so I think that, this focus on the Global South is partly, this is where young people are, this is where the population is, this is where some of the dynamism is, it's certainly where a lot of conflict is. It's also where, from the U.S. perspective, a lot of the concern about possible terrorism and instability and the insecurity that leads to migration flows that creates all sort of problems in the north. But it really does continue to come back to that basic concern, which is the U.S. needs to counter China, global competition, and that the global south, has got to be, in a sense, won over. And that's a very tricky proposition if you're from the global south, because it makes you feel like you're derivative of something else rather than being primary to the concern of the United States.
But it's interesting that you say US and China and not India, because at G20, India was projecting itself as a leader of the global south.
Well, I think India did that very effectively. It really, it projected itself, as I understand it, not as leading the global south, but as Samir Saran likes to say, as leading collectively with the global south, being a voice that brings together that solidarity of leadership across the G20 leaders, Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, in sequence. I think, from the White House and those sitting in Washington, they still see it as, they would like to lead the global south, recognizing the extraordinary significance of India. But you're right, India's positioning is very distinctive, it's very different, and it really is adding leadership with a southern voice. And then the question is, will the money be there, right, for development assistance, for humanitarianism, for all the global public goods that a leader, a major power needs to provide if it's going to sustain its influence?
I know I told you 15 minutes, so I guess I'll have to wrap this up. Let me ask you the last question. How badly did the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan impact its image?
How did it impact it?
The US image, because increasingly people are saying that, the US is a fair weather friend, come to the Tuesday.
Yeah.
And that seems to be growing as a thought amongst a lot of other countries. And that's also being used to good effect by people who don't like the US so much. They keep saying, it's a transactional country and things like that. Has that sort of, that feeling, has it grown post the US withdrawal from Afghanistan?
I think it's grown in the global south. It's grown in the developing world, and it for two reasons. One is Afghanistan, which, just as you said, it made the U.S. look like, it would just cut ties when it was sort of done. It's done, and there's images of people, clawing onto the side of the airplanes that were just taking Americans away, and just willfully blind to the plight of Afghans, and especially to Afghan women and to Afghan girls. It was just devastating. I think, to be very honest, many Americans were devastated by the images too. But the global impact was deeply damaging for the U.S. Now, then two things have happened. In Europe, America's image was restored by the fact that it came to the support of Ukraine and really worked with its NATO partners. But in the developing world, the failure of the United States to really effectively persuade Israel to restrain itself in its response to Gaza and to the horrific attacks that it experienced on October 7th. Understandable that it wants to defend itself, but I think many people in the developing world see the response by Israel and the killing of over 25,000 Palestinians now, innocents. Many people see this as a continuation. So first, America doesn't care about Afghans, and now it doesn't care about Palestinians. And that cry of America's hypocrisy, its double standards, its selective commitment to human rights and humanitarian values and principles, that I think it's hard to remember a time in recent history when that concern for America's hypocrisy has been as vociferous and strong as it is now. So it is a very real problem for the U.S.
Do you think it's going to help multilateralism?
No, I don't think it's going to help multilateralism, because right now multilateralism still hinges on American leadership. Now, India's done tremendously well with the G20. Those 4 G20 southern leaders are doing their part. But if you want to have a system that hangs together, as opposed to, a patchwork quilt of many different organizations solving the problems, if you want to have that anchor multilateral institute, you need the U.S. commitment, and then you need states to wish to follow the U.S. And that hypocrisy, that feeling of hypocrisy and of double standards, makes it harder for America to not only to wish to lead, it also makes it harder to inspire others to follow. And that is the challenge of our time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinjamuri. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri from Chatham House talking to us about American politics, multilateralism, and the global south. I do hope you enjoyed this edition from StratnewsGlobal, and I look forward to having you with us again. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till we meet again, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.